You may recall a couple of years ago when the estate of Theodore Geisel, who's better known as Dr. Seuss, of course, made the decision to stop selling a number of Seuss's books because the books featured culturally insensitive words and themes. One of the books, for example, contained a shocking reference to Eskimos, and we're not allowed to call Eskimos Eskimos anymore for reasons that have never fully been explained. But it's too late to explain these things to Dr. Seuss himself, as he died 30 years ago. All they can do is posthumously label his work bigoted and shove a chunk of his catalog into the memory hole, which is exactly what they did. Now, many people, the optimistic ones anyway, thought that maybe the whole Seuss saga represented cancel culture at its most absurd. And at the very least, they figured it's the most ludicrous example of censoring a dead children's author that we'll ever see. Can't get worse than that. But they forget, in spite of my many reminders, that progressivism is progressive like cancer. It grows and spreads and doesn't stop, can't stop until its host is dead. And so this past weekend, another beloved children's author who died a year before Dr. Seuss found himself in the woke cult's crosshairs. And this incident actually makes the Seuss cancellation look downright reasonable by comparison. So The Guardian reports on the efforts by Roald Dahl's publisher to actually rewrite his books in order to bring them into line with modern sensibilities. Reading from the report, it says, Roald Dahl's children's books are being rewritten to remove language deemed offensive by the publisher Puffin. Puffin has hired sensitivity readers to rewrite chunks of the author's text to make sure the books, quote, can continue to be enjoyed by all today, resulting in extensive changes across Dahl's works. Hundreds of changes were made to the original text, and some passages not written by Dahl have been added. But the Roald Dahl Story Company said, quote, it's not unusual to review the language during a new print run, and any changes were small and carefully considered. Now, if you thought that the DEI consultants were useless parasites, what can we say about professional sensitivity readers? Well, I suppose we would say much the same about them, though perhaps maybe we might be tempted to give them a little bit of credit for finding such a profitable yet low-effort grift. And speaking of low effort, here are some of the changes that were made at their behest. Quote, edits have been made to descriptions of characters' physical appearances. The word fat has been cut from every new edition of relevant books, while the word ugly has also been culled, the Daily Telegraph reported. Augustus Gloop in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is now described as enormous. In the Twits, Mrs. Twit is no longer ugly and beastly, but just beastly. Well, that's good, because now the line has left open the possibility that Mrs. Twit might be beastly, yet not ugly. Perhaps she is a big, beastly, beautiful woman. That might be a somewhat incoherent image. I can't imagine what a beastly yet attractive person would look like, but at least you get the alliteration there. Big, beastly, beautiful. Reading more, it says, in The Witches, a paragraph explaining that witches are bald beneath their wigs ends with this new line. Quote, there are plenty of other reasons why women might wear wigs, and there is certainly nothing wrong with that. I'm surprised that they didn't add yet another line to note also that not all witches are supernatural creatures who create magical potions to turn children into mice, as they do in Dahl's book. You know, there are other kinds of witches as well. In fact, we even have witches in Congress, quite a few of them. One of them used to be Speaker of the House. It seems that sensitivity readers missed an opportunity to fully combat the stigma against witches. I'm a little disappointed by that. Hopefully they'll catch it on the next go-around. Back to The Guardian says, in previous editions of James and the Giant Peach, the centipede sings, Aunt Sponge was terrifically fat and tremendously flabby at that, and Aunt Spiker was thin as a wire and dry as a bone, only drier. Both verses have been removed, and in their places are the rhymes, Aunt Sponge was a nasty old brute and deserved to be squashed by the fruit, and Aunt Spiker was much of the same and deserves half of the blame. This is another important edit. As we all know, it's deeply offensive to call a woman fat. We should instead be polite and merely call them brutes who deserve to be squished to death. But, we shouldn't be surprised that these changes make no sense at all. After all, the woke police, they still haven't quite figured out what to do with fatness, because on the one hand, of course, they want to stop you from calling people fat because it's intolerant. But on the other hand, they preach about fat acceptance and declare that fat is beautiful. But if fat is acceptable and beautiful, then why can't we call people fat? Wouldn't we be complimenting them in that case? I mean, one of the greatest things you could say to someone is, hey, you fat ass. You're calling them beautiful. So the sensitivity readers are a bit confused on that point. But one thing they know for sure is that any reference to biological sex is, of course, terribly offensive now. Reading again, it says, references to female characters have disappeared. Miss Trunchbull and Matilda, once a most formidable female, is now a most formidable woman. Gender-neutral terms have been added in places where Charlie and the Chocolate Factory's Oompa Loompas were small men. They are now small people. The Cloud Men in James the Giant Peach have become Cloud People. Puffin and the Roald Dahl Story Company made the changes in conjunction with Inclusive Minds, which its spokesperson describes as, quote, a collective for people who are passionate about inclusion and accessibility in children's literature. Alexandra Strick, a co-founder of Inclusive Minds, says that they aim to ensure authentic representation by working closely with the book world and with those who have lived experience of any facet of diversity. A notice from the publisher sits at the bottom of the copyright page of the latest editions of Dahl's books and says, quote, the wonderful words of Roald Dahl can transport you to different worlds and introduce you to the most marvelous characters. This book was written many years ago, and so we regularly review the language to ensure that it can continue to be enjoyed by all today. Now, as I said at the beginning, this is all significantly worse than simply banning books or taking them off the shelves. It represents a rather startling escalation by the woke brigade. Because if they had, removed the offensive, quote-unquote, Dahl books from circulation, that would be a ridiculous and shameful move, just like it was with Dr. Seuss. But it would at least be honest, more honest at any rate, and it would keep the author's work intact. But now they've taken the liberty to rewrite the books and change the author's words without his consent to make it more acceptable by their standards. And you don't need to strain very hard to see where this is going. It's one thing to imagine a world where Shakespeare has been entirely removed from the classroom because he was a white male who authored works that contained problematic themes. That prospect is disturbing enough if it isn't already happening, which it probably is. But now imagine a world where kids are taught Shakespeare, except they're reading things that Shakespeare never actually wrote. I would rather Shakespeare be cast aside as a toxic white male than retroactively edited to be turned into a woke, transgendered polysexual or whatever they would do to him. Yet that's where we're headed. Now, the problem with this approach is not simply that it's politically correct. We have moved way past mere political correctness at this point. The problem is that, first of all, it's a lie. So you may wish that an author had written something a different way and used different language, gone this direction instead of that. But those wishes are born from the fact that the work is not your work. It came from someone else's mind. You wish he had written it a certain way, but he didn't write it that way. He wrote what he wrote, no matter how you feel about it. This is no different from rewriting the history books to tell the story of what you think should have happened in history, rather than telling what actually did happen. And of course, that's exactly what they're going to do with the history books, if they aren't already. The left believes that it has the moral authority to alter anything it wants to alter, because it doesn't believe that anything that conflicts with their worldview has any right to exist in the first place. And that's really what this comes down to. From their perspective, Roald Dahl had no right to author those kinds of books in the first place, because it conflicts with them and it makes them feel bad. And so he had no right to do that. And so that gives them the moral license to do whatever they want. If that means burning the books, banning them, they can do that. If that means rewriting it, it means that. This is not only unethical and arrogant in the extreme, editing a dead writer's words so that they sound better to you, but it also deprives children of the full enrichment and edification that can come from reading the vivid and even maybe sometimes a little upsetting, if the child is an especially sensitive type, words of a great imaginative writer. See, we tend to worry that this kind of censorship will help to indoctrinate children into wokeness, and we're right to worry about that. We should be worried about it. But it's perhaps an even greater concern that it will help to make our children into bland, boring people, which of course is an inevitable consequence of making them woke. And if you want to make children bland and boring and bored, there is no better way to do it than to reimagine great children's literature so that it sounds like something written by a diversity consultant. That is just about the worst and most disrespectful thing you can do to a piece of literature. And it's also a very terrible thing to do to the child who is reading it. I'll move over to the members block. If you're not a member yet, become a member and use code Walsh at checkout for 2 months free on all annual plans. Hope to see you there. If not, talk to you tomorrow. Godspeed.